Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, September 14th, 2022. One of the first unions that reached a tentative agreement with freight railroads has now voted to authorize a strike as top cabinet members in the Biden administration continue to hold urgent meetings trying to resolve the differences. We'll get the latest from White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, and we'll talk with a business reporter from The Hill about the prospect for a rail workers' strike and its potential impact on the U.S. economy. President Joe Biden at the North American International Auto Show in Detroit, promoting electric vehicles and announcing $900 million to build the infrastructure that supports them, charging stations specifically. Republican U.S. Senate candidate in New Hampshire, who is an outspoken supporter for former President Donald Trump, Don Bolduc, celebrating his primary victory and the chance to take on incumbent Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan this November. Monkeypox outbreak, the subject of today's Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee hearing with federal health officials, both Democratic and Republican senators suggesting the response dealing with testing and vaccine distribution could have been better early on. And we'll talk about state government's response to monkeypox with a correspondent at Kaiser Health News. He says some southern states have not done very well, raising questions about a pattern of discrimination against LGBTQ plus individuals as the monkeypox virus has been concentrated in those communities. From CNN Business, a freight railroad strike and the economic upheaval it could cause is getting closer and closer to reality. While two more rail unions reached tentative agreements with railroad management on new contracts Tuesday, the two most important unions representing the engineers and conductors who make up the two-person crews on each train remain at loggerheads in negotiations. If they don't resolve their differences, the first national strike in 30 years could start early Friday. The railroads work under a unique labor law that allows the federal government to intervene to keep the workers on the job rather than freely allowing a strike or a lockout of workers by management. That reporting from CNN Business. Reporters today asking White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre for the latest on the negotiations. She spoke on Air Force One during the flight from Washington, D.C. to Detroit.
Karine, can you give us an update on the railway strike possibility, what the government is doing, and what the latest is on talks?
So the latest is, this morning, Secretary Walsh is hosting the rail companies and unions in Washington, D.C. at the Department of Labor. You guys may already know that. It's happening literally as we are flying to Detroit at this moment. The president and members of cabinet have been in touch with both unions and companies involved multiple times in order to try to avert a rail shutdown. Our administration has been engaged in these negotiations for months, as I mentioned yesterday in the briefing room in the early days of spring. All parties need to stay at the table, bargain in good faith to resolve outstanding issues, and come to an agreement. A shutdown of our rail system is unacceptable outcome for our economy, and the American people and all parties must work to avoid just that.
Are you putting any contingency plans in place in case it does come to a shutdown?
Again, we've been talking to both sides. The president, I mentioned this yesterday as well, while he was in Boston, had a conversation with both sides of this issue, and our continued message stays the same, which is that they need to continue to negotiate at the table in good faith. Again, Secretary Walsh is at the Department of Labor hosting both sides, and we're going to continue to work to make sure that we don't put another burden on the American people, the American families.
Senator Burr put forward a resolution urging both sides urging that both sides accept the Biden board's recommendation on the rail strike. In other words, that the president get behind backing those recommendations. Do you have a position either on Senator Burr's resolution or more broadly about the intervention with respect to the recommendations of the board?
So the negotiating process of the Presidential Emergency Board, which the president formed back in July, on July 15th to be exact, puts the onus of resolving differences on the parties themselves. And so this is an issue that can and should be worked out between the rail companies and the unions, not by Congress. In fact, parties are at the table right now, as I just said, at the Department of Labor. Look, this is they have been able to come together and negotiate in the past, and that's what we're expecting this time around as well.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre speaking with reporters on Air Force One. Karl Evers-Hillstrom is a business and lobbying reporter with The Hill, has been following this story. He joins us now by phone. Thank you very much. You report today that the first union authorizing a strike.
Yeah, so one of the unions that had actually reached a tentative agreement with the railroads just had their membership voted down today, and also authorized a strike. They've pushed the date of the strike back to later this month to try to give both parties more time to negotiate, but it certainly is an indicator that a lot more of these unions are going to have similar results. And really, that just brings us much, much closer to a strike. That feels like it's almost a certainty unless there's some sort of breakthrough in the talks here.
These talks are happening behind closed doors. Are we getting some readouts on how they're going?
Well, the Biden administration, Labor Secretary Marty Walsh has been very involved in these discussions. They say that both parties are negotiating in good faith, that they actually do want to reach a deal, which, if true, is a good development. The unions have been kind of accusing railroads of kind of stonewalling and basically waiting for Congress to kind of forcefully implement a deal that they want. But other than that, we haven't heard a ton. I mean, really, the sticking points are around really basically whether workers can get time off without being penalized, to go see a doctor or for a family emergency or something of that nature. And really, it's not really about the money at this point. That's been a major factor. So it'll really come down to whether railroads are willing to compromise and provide unions with a little bit stronger language for workers there in the contract.
In anticipation of a possible strike and a shutdown of freight railroads, companies have been sort of taking their own steps to mitigate any problems. What hit has there been on the economy just with this threat of a strike?
Yeah, like you said, even the threat of a strike is a pretty serious issue for our economy and our supply chains. What you're seeing is that the big companies, the Walmarts and the Amazons, have kind of bought up all of the alternative transport options, kind of like air cargo and things of that nature. So that's going to be those are much more expensive than taking stuff by rail. So those are costs that are going to be passed down to consumers. And then if the strike happens, and we are already seeing rail disruptions right now, a lot of the smaller companies just won't really be able to ship their stuff because a lot of these alternative forms of transit have already been reserved by kind of the big companies.
We're talking with Karl Evers-Hillstrom with The Hill. We've also been talking about the possibility of Congress intervening. A lot of the leaders being asked about this, they're kind of saying, let's wait and see. But what are you hearing about whether Congress will take that step?
It certainly seems that Congress will take the step if they are forced to. Democrats have said that they want both sides to just keep negotiating and they don't want to step in until they have to. Republicans today are trying to force a vote on a resolution that would basically impose the contract that the workers at that one union just voted down. Democrats are expected to block that. So really, we've got kind of an impasse here in Congress as well about how to handle it. Democrats have not played their cards yet as to what kind of legislation they might put out and how it might differ from Republicans. Whether they might put out maybe like a more pro-union proposal, or whether they might just vote to block a strike for a certain amount of days to give the two sides a little bit more time to negotiate, which is an option that businesses are not really looking for because that would kind of just extend the uncertainty that we're experiencing right now. And
finally, what are the estimates of the economic damage should there be a strike?
There's been a variety of estimates. The railroads put out a report saying it would be as much as $2 billion a day in damage. Others have said that it would likely be smaller if it was only a few days. But I think most people agree that we're talking about serious damage. We're talking about almost kind of a crisis here for our economy. We're talking about inflation spiking potentially. You're talking about ships piling up at ports and really worsening supply chains ahead of the holiday season, which would really deal a big blow to customers later on this year. And then we're talking about food prices also jumping up because a lot of stuff's going to spoil if it can't get from the railroads to their destination. So all in all, there's a lot of stuff that goes by rail, and I think everyone agrees that Congress should not let a strike happen, or at the very least last more than a few days due to the economic damage.
Karl Evers-Hillstrom, business and lobbying reporter with The Hill. His stories are at thehill.com, and he's on Twitter at Karl M. Evers. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And on the Senate floor today, Senator Roger Wicker, Republican from Mississippi, and Senator Richard Burr, Republican from North Carolina, did try to get unanimous consent, which means all senators must agree to bring up their resolution that would have the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations implemented on both the unions and the freight railroad companies. Here's Senator Wicker.
Pursuant to the statute, when we get to a situation like this, Congress can step in, and that is what my friend is going to ask us to do in just a few minutes. The Congress can pass the recommendation of the PEB in full. The Senate can pass it, send it over to the House, send it to the President, who has endorsed the recommendation in full, and we can avoid this strike. And that's what we ought to be doing. So I want to commend my friend from North Carolina for his leadership in this case. If the trains stop running, our economy grinds to a halt, and that is the very reason this law is in place, and it's the very reason why it is incumbent on us as senators and representatives to pass a resolution implementing the PEB.
Senator Roger Wicker, Republican, among the Democratic caucus senators who objected to bringing up and passing this resolution at this point. Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont. Also, Amtrak announcing it's canceled all long-distance trains nationwide starting Thursday as it prepares for a possible freight rail strike. Since those long-distance trains, most of them do use freight tracks, the Northeast corridor between Boston and Washington is unaffected. From the Detroit News, President Joe Biden test drove an all-electric Cadillac SUV and slid into the front seat of a new Corvette as part of a midday tour Wednesday of Detroit's Resurrected Auto Show ahead of an afternoon speech on the auto industry's transition to electric vehicles. Here he is in that Cadillac SUV.
Come on, jump in. I'll give you a ride to Washington. Come on, we're ready. Is that my Uber? Uber ride? That's an Uber.
What do you think, Mr. President?
I like it. I like it.
President Biden in the Cadillac SUV. He is a self-described car guy owning a 1967 Corvette Stingray. And when he got into the new Corvette, gasoline-powered, he said, "I'm telling the head of my Secret Service detail I'm driving home." And later, as mentioned, he gave a speech at the Detroit Auto Show talking about the spending bills he signed recently that deal with increased production of electric vehicles and batteries and EV chargers, including the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that CHIPS and Science bill. Specific announcement today from the president, $900 million plan to build 500,000 EV chargers across more than 50,000 miles of national highway in 35 states.
It used to be that to buy an electric car, you had to make all sorts of compromises. But not now. Thanks to American ingenuity, American engineers, American auto workers, it's all changing. Today, if you want an electric vehicle with a long range, you can buy one made in America. If you want one that charges quickly, buy American. You want one that's fast in the quarter mile, buy American. So, by the way, while we're here in Detroit, building in America, we're making it easier for folks at home to buy it here in America. Companies have announced new investments of more than $36 billion in electric vehicles and $48 billion in battery manufacturing here in the U.S. And we're just getting started. I signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act. It gives tax credits to new electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, made in America. And for the first time, you get a tax credit if you buy a used electric vehicle. That's all coming. And part of the infrastructure law, we're investing $7.5 billion to build electric vehicle charging stations all across America. So today, I'm pleased to announce we're approving funding for the first 35 states, including Michigan, to build their own electric charging infrastructure throughout their state. And y'all are going to be part of a network of 500,000 charging stations. 500,000 throughout the country, installed by the IBEW.
President Biden at the North American International Auto Show in Detroit, Michigan today. Back in Washington, D.C., House Republicans focusing on the economy and the president's agenda. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, Republican from New York, the conference chair, leading off a news conference.
Yesterday, Joe Biden hosted a party at the White House to celebrate his Inflation Expansion Act. On the same day that scorching inflation numbers came in hotter than expected and the stock market plunged. President Biden and House Democrats' reckless spending and failed far-left policies have plunged our economy into a recession, stolen wages from America's workforce, destroyed retirement savings, particularly impacting seniors in my district and across America, and left families with the highest food prices since 1979. Everywhere I traveled across my district, everyone I spoke with across America throughout August, I heard about the pain that so many constituents are feeling due to Joe Biden and House Democrats' failed radical policies. And my colleagues are here today to share those similar stories about what they heard this August recess. What are the realities that the American people are facing? The Democrats' inflation crisis has New Yorkers paying nearly $700 more per month and is expected to cost families across my state more than $8,000 a year. That's, in many cases, a month's salary. If you look at the inflation rate, it's taking away a month's salary of every American family. Wages aren't keeping up with inflation as everything is costing more. Americans are making less. Grocery prices are leaving many families struggling to put food on the table. Families are struggling to afford their gas and energy prices due to Democrats' war on American energy that's only predicted to get worse. This winter, families across my district in upstate New York and the North Country are expected to pay the highest price to heat their homes in well over a decade. The lawlessness and rampant violent crime continues in our communities due to Democrats' soft-on-crime policies. And the sad part is, Democrats know the consequences of their radical policies, and they continue to double down. Today, Vice President Kamala Harris is continuing this tone-deaf celebration in upstate New York, applauding and selling a law that helps the wealthy and inflicts further pain on hardworking families. The American people cannot afford another year of failed Democrat one-party rule in Washington. It's time for leadership that listens to the concerns of every American, which House Republicans are doing every day. We are working hard to end this one-party Democrat reign in Washington and put forth our commitment to America that works for our constituents and the American people.
Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, Republican from New York. She's the House Republican Conference chair, part of a news conference with other House Republican leaders today. On Wall Street, the Dow up 30, NASDAQ up 86, S&P up 13. Insider reports asked on Wednesday whether she would seek another term as Speaker of the House if Democrats retain the chamber. Democratic Representative Nancy Pelosi of California pointedly refused to answer the question, noting the Speaker's prediction that Democrats will pick up seats in the House this year, along with broad calls for generational change. Insider asked Pelosi at her weekly press conference if she planned to remain in her post if House Democrats emerge victorious in the November midterm elections. Pelosi proceeded to explain why she believes Democrats will retain the majority, speaking about the political ramifications, about the Supreme Court's overturning Roe v. Wade, and the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. That from Insider. Here's the exchange at today's news conference.
If Democrats do retain the House, do you plan to seek another term as Speaker? Why or why not?
Not after that glorious introduction you gave. Look, right now, my focus is on holding the House. How many times have I told you over the past year and a half plus that the Democrats would hold the House? despite some of the so-called conventional, so-called wisdom in Washington, D.C., saying that in the off year, the president's party always loses Congress or seats. The fact is, that isn't conventional, and it isn't wisdom, because convention has changed. We communicate in a different way. We have a different reality here now in terms of our own democracy being on the ballot, our planet being on the ballot, the future of our country being on the ballot, and also we always believed we would win, so we always prepared for it. Mobilization to own the ground. Our distinguished chairman, Sean Patrick Maloney, began that even before January 6th. As soon as he was chosen by our colleagues to be the chair, even before January 6th, you can just imagine the momentum it picked up. Secondly, mobilization depends on messaging, and the legislation that we are passing has been very, very, shall we say, encouraging to our grassroots. And then the third is, of course, the resources. It begins with an M, but I don't like to bring it up. The resources needed to win. So we have been ready. So when the Supreme Court decision came down, it wasn't a case of, oh, if only we had known. No, we were ready because we believed and because we saw the urgency of it. Now, in addition to that, forgetting what we believe and what we were prepared for, the most important part of it is our candidates believed. They believed in the future, they believed in themselves, they believed that they could win in those districts. So we were in place with a great array of candidates, just a few more chosen since that decision. But the decision has really made a remarkable difference.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, at her weekly news conference. She is 82 years old and has been the House Democratic leader, either as Speaker or Minority Leader, since 2003. A story from The Hill. New Hampshire State Senate President Chuck Morse, Republican, an establishment favorite, early Wednesday conceded defeat to retired Army General Don Bolduc, who has espoused former President Trump's false 2020 election claims, in the state's Republican primary to face incumbent Senator Maggie Hassan, Democrat, in November. Morse tweeted early in the morning that he called Bolduc to congratulate him and said that the focus needs to be on defeating Hassan in November. The race is expected to be one of the most competitive of the cycle as Republicans attempt to regain the majority in the Senate, while Democrats try to maintain and expand their majority. Hassan won her first term in 2016 by 1/10 of a point. That reporting from The Hill. Don Bolduc spoke to his supporters Tuesday night in Hampton, New Hampshire. In this portion, it begins as he's holding a shield with arrows sticking out of it.
We have taken their arrows. We have successfully protected ourselves. We are now going to rally around the circle, unity, freedom, liberty, and together
we're going to beat Maggie Hassan.
Maggie Hassan locked you down.
Yes, she did.
Yes. Maggie Hassan closed your business.
Yes.
Maggie Hassan closed our schools.
Yes.
Our places of worship.
Yes.
She masked our children to the detriment of their education.
Yes.
And their mental health.
And their mental health.
Yes.
She politicizes veterans. I will support veterans.
Yes.
She spends money recklessly for her own advantage. She is bought and paid for by outsiders to work for them in Washington, D.C., and not for you.
Yeah.
She has sided with every single one of Biden's failed economic policies, fiscal policies, and she has created a weak America with the opening of our borders and enforcing illegal immigration, not legal immigration.
Right.
Yes. She calls me names. The only thing that I call her is a bad U.S. Senator.
Don Bolduc, now New Hampshire U.S. Senate Republican candidate after the primary victory Tuesday night. He spoke in Hampton, New Hampshire. Former President Donald Trump did not endorse anyone in this race, although it was reported that Don Bolduc does support former President Trump. And on the other side, he defeated Chuck Morse, who was endorsed by other Republican prominent figures, including the governor, John Sununu of New Hampshire. A New York Times story adding that besides Mr. Bolduc, Republicans in the state also chose a hard-right nominee for the House, Caroline Leavitt, a former staff member to Donald J. Trump's White House press office, who echoed the former president's inflammatory language and provocations. She beat Matt Mowers, who had the backing of House Republican leaders and will face Representative Chris Pappas, a two-term Democrat. That from the New York Times. New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Delaware all held primaries on Tuesday. It was the final date of major primary elections this year. On Tuesday, President Joe Biden flew from Washington, D.C. to Delaware to vote, spending just a few hours on the ground. Today, the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre asked by reporters as they were flying on Air Force One during the trip from Washington to Detroit why that trip to Delaware was needed when the president had other options to vote, either vote early or vote by absentee.
Can you tell us why the president went to Wilmington yesterday to vote in the primary when he could have had an absentee ballot, or he could have voted in person, early voting, when he was there last weekend?
Thanks. I know there's been a lot of interest in this. So every American, as you know, has a sacred and constitutional right to vote. The president exercised that right alongside other Delawareans last night. That's what you saw. Just a couple to answer your specific questions. Look, as you know, the president has a very heavy schedule. He's the president of the United States. It worked out best for him to vote yesterday, to vote on Tuesday. He thought it was important to exercise his constitutional right to vote, as I just mentioned, and set an example by showing the importance of voting. He also had the opportunity to say hello to poll workers and thank them for their work. And we know how under attack poll workers have been these past several years. And as some of you noted, some of your colleagues noted that many presidents, it's not unusual, head home to vote in their local elections, and he thought it was important to do so yesterday.
Do you think that it would have been better then to make it more of like a public event for him to sort of like tout it a little bit more? It was sort of a surprise, right, until he landed there?
The president has been voting in Delaware for decades. And this is something that was important to do. He wasn't going to miss an opportunity to vote yesterday, and he did that. It is not unusual for him. He's done that for many decades, and so he had an opportunity to thank the poll workers. He had an opportunity, I think, by the president going to vote, that sends a very strong message to the American public.
The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre with reporters on Air Force One. Fox News reporting on this story, writing the exact cost of Biden's trip to Delaware is unclear, but the Air Force revealed in 2014 that the average cost per flying hour of the presidential Boeing 747 was $206,000. Biden took the smaller 757 version of Air Force One on the trip, however, according to Bloomberg. That from Fox News. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Here are some of the live events on Thursday on C-SPAN Radio. At 10 a.m. Eastern, the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Gary Gensler, testifies before the Senate Banking Committee. And at 2 p.m. Eastern, a House Veterans Affairs Committee hearing on women's veterans' access to reproductive health care, including abortion, through the Veterans Health Administration. Get C-SPAN Radio schedule updates on the C-SPAN Now video app at cspan.org and on Twitter at C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. An article at CNBC, monkeypox continues to spread across the U.S., but the pace of new cases has slowed over the last several weeks. Dr. Rochelle Walensky, director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, told lawmakers Wednesday. She said at a hearing, "We approach this news with cautious optimism." The article goes on, the disease is rarely fatal but causes painful lesions resembling pimples or blisters. There has been one confirmed death in the U.S. as a result of the disease, according to Walensky. The hearing was covered by C-SPAN. It's the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. And both Democratic chair and ranking Republican on the committee criticized how federal health officials have responded so far. First, here's the chair, Patty Murray of Washington State, as she questions Dr. Walensky about the availability of monkeypox tests.
I know each of your agencies have worked relentlessly to respond first to COVID and now monkeypox, but I have to say, frankly, too many missteps were made early on in the response, and a couple hundred cases turned into 21,000. It is unacceptable to communities who already experience barriers to accessing health care, like the LGBTQ+ and the Black and Latino communities that are hardest hit by this outbreak. Access to testing was an early challenge in the monkeypox response, with many people reporting significant delays in both accessing the tests and learning their results. To continue to have these challenges around testing is just simply unacceptable. So, Dr. Walensky, let me start with you. How is the CDC working to make sure tests are more accessible and results are available earlier?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. One of the big challenges that we had in terms of access to testing was both patients understanding that they were presenting with a new infection, and providers understanding that this was a new infection that they had to test for. Indeed, another important clinical consideration was that people were coming in requesting a test when they had no symptoms and they had no rash. As Dr. Califf noted, the test for this infection is a swab of the rash. So in fact, there is no other FDA-approved test. We need to have a rash in order to conduct those tests. So much of what we've done, and I should mention that we've always had more capacity than we have had tests coming in. To date, we've used about 14 to 20% of our capacity. But to address these access issues, we had to work with clinicians, we had to work with patients, we had to do an extraordinary amount of outreach so that providers would understand how to test, patients would understand when to come in for a test, and our public health partners would know not to gatekeep those tests. And so that was a work that we did early on as we were scaling up testing, knowing that we may need more testing coming forward. So through the Laboratory Response Network, we increased our capacity to test through expanding the manual extraction to automated extraction. Then we worked, as you heard, through our commercial labs to expand testing across the country, and simultaneously working with outreach and education to providers, clinicians, patients, and public health.
CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky before the Senate Health Committee, questioned by Senator Patty Murray, Democrat of Washington State. She is the chair. You heard Dr. Walensky refer to Dr. Califf, the FDA the Commissioner, Dr. Robert Califf, also testifying, as did Dr. Anthony Fauci, head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and Dawn O'Connell, with the Health and Human Services Department, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. Here is the ranking Republican on the committee, Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina, asking Dawn O'Connell about distribution of monkeypox vaccines.
Dawn, news outlets have recently reported the administration's evaluating whether some doses of Jynneos should be held back in the stockpile to meet our requirements for smallpox rather than distributed to support the current monkeypox response. This seems to conflict with FDA's recent decision to implement dose-sparing strategies, which indicates that we need to maximize the number of available doses. Can you square this up for me?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for that question. So we continue to maintain our smallpox preparedness. That's critical. Our frontline vaccines continue to be available and have not been impacted by our monkeypox response. But we have added the capability to be able to provide the Jynneos vaccine to those that are immunocompromised in the case of a smallpox outbreak. And we are evaluating with each dose that we make available to the monkeypox outbreak what it means for that preparedness in smallpox. I've met with the FEMC, I've consulted with them to understand whether we need a separate monkeypox stockpile so we can pull those vaccines off the shelf and not worry about the preparedness for the immunocompromised in a smallpox outbreak.
Have you ever thought about the message you send to the at-risk population when you suggest to them that though they're in the midst of an infection problem, that we're discussing holding back in case we have an outbreak of smallpox? Now, let me just explain. We know that we have 13 to 15 million gay men in this country, in the United States. Tony, we have about 1.9 million HIV/AIDS positive gay men. There's your immunocompromised population, 1.9 million. Your risk pool for sexually transmitted monkeypox, about 13 to 15 million. And somehow we're cheering the fact that we put out 700,000 vaccines. If I'm in that community, and then on top of that, we have the subdermal decision. I'm going to cut the amount that you get. And there's not sufficient public, transparent information about that. You've got a population that's a little bit questioning whether you're doing everything to help them. And that may be a reason that we've only had 461,000 people vaccinated out of a pool, a defined pool of up to 15 million people, of which 1.9 million are immunocompromised because they're HIV positive.
Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina questioning Health and Human Services Assistant Secretary Dawn O'Connell at today's hearing on the federal response to the monkeypox outbreak. Daniel Chang is a correspondent with Kaiser Health News covering the southern states, and he's been looking at how different states are responding to monkeypox. He joins us now by phone. Thank you so much. What have you found?
Hi, Michael. Well, look, what we found is that the response across states has been pretty uneven, not just across states, but also within the states themselves, among counties and municipalities. But in general, I think what we've seen is that in the southern states with the greatest number of cases, which we identified, or the CDC has noted, are Florida, Texas, and Georgia, the response has been pretty different from the approach taken in states like New York and California and Illinois, which also have large numbers of cases, but have declared local emergencies and taken other measures to try to perhaps prioritize LGBTQ populations and to improve coordination among their agencies, perhaps even allow more medical providers such as EMS workers to provide vaccines. And the southern states feel like they don't need that.
You write that this may go beyond just monkeypox, that the perception of the response to the virus has lacked coordination in the South, has rekindled familiar concerns about recent state policies dealing with the LGBTQ communities. Explain more about that.
Well, part of what's been rekindled, I think, are concerns that we all saw during the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 90s, assuming we were all around back then, which I was. But what I'm also referring to is the context of state legislation in places such as Texas and Florida, where the state legislators have adopted, for instance, the Parental Rights and Education Bill in Florida, which is referred to by its opponents as the Don't Say Gay bill, that prohibits discussion of sexual identity or sexual orientation and gender identity in grades K through 3, but also has a ripple effect and has limited really discussion of the topic in other grades. And I think that that's one of the more commonly known or well-known piece of legislation that Florida has adopted recently that might make folks in the LGBTQ community feel that perhaps, they're under attack. Similarly, the state has banned the provision or the coverage of gender-affirming care for people who are transgender and receive Medicaid. We've had legislation that prohibits participation in school sports by transgender people, and also have asked the Board of Medicine to adopt a, quote, standard of care that would prohibit doctors from providing gender-affirming care to minors. So I think a lot of that has created an atmosphere, and in Texas, by the way, I apologize, I believe it was the state attorney general had issued an opinion saying that he thought that the doctors should be, prosecuted if they provide such care to children. So I think that even with their parents' consent. Actually, I think it was to investigate the parents for child abuse if they were to allow their children to receive gender-affirming care, which can range from behavioral and social therapy to hormones, so-called puberty blockers, and when they reach adulthood, perhaps surgery as well. And by adulthood, sometimes that it gets a little complicated, but there are different ages at which surgeries are recommended. And the point is that a lot of this legislation has created an atmosphere that people in the LGBTQ community feel is discriminatory and limits their rights.
We're talking with Daniel Chang from Kaiser Health News. When it comes to the response to the monkeypox outbreak, what is the interaction coordination between federal and state authorities?
Well, the federal government is the one that owns the vaccine stockpile that distributes it from the strategic national stockpile to the states. And much of what we saw at the outset showed that the federal government was not sufficiently prepared. We didn't have enough vaccine doses in the strategic national stockpile. We neglected to maintain the doses that we had before they expired. And the way that it was distributed was also somewhat unfamiliar and different to the states because the vaccine was distributed by an agency within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that doesn't typically, distribute vaccines the way that we did the COVID-19 vaccines, which use the CDC system. The federal government was limited in terms of the number of sites and states that it would deliver vaccines to. In Florida, it was 5 counties. And my understanding is that in most states, that was about the number of sites that they could send vaccines to, which then left it up to the states to get them to their final destination and get shots in arms. The states also had to sort of order by email as opposed to using an automated system, and they had to track where the doses were going manually. So, this is what I heard from the states in terms of the frustrations they had to deal with in receiving and distributing vaccine from the federal government. Although I should say that this week, or on September 6th, rather, the HHS Secretary Xavier Becerra said that the agency had awarded a $20 million grant to a wholesale company, AmerisourceBergen, to basically distribute vaccine to more sites within states and get these vaccines to states and the people who need them faster.
Daniel Chang, correspondent with Kaiser Health News. Find his stories at khn.org, and he's on Twitter at dchangmiami. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Michael. Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Washington Today. A story from Reuters. Former Governor Bill Richardson, who has privately worked to secure the release of American detainees abroad, has held meetings this week in Russia, where WNBA star Brittany Griner and former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan remain jailed, a source familiar with the matter said on Wednesday. The former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations was on his way back, the source said, but did not provide further details on whom he met with or how his meetings went. The Kremlin on Wednesday had no comment on Richardson's trip. There were no meetings at the Kremlin, spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters on a conference call. I have nothing to tell you on this subject. That from Reuters. More on this from U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price.
It's been reported that ex-Governor Richardson is in Moscow this week, presumably to try and help release the U.S. prisoners there. Do you have any details of that trip? Would you support it? Do you condemn it? Do you think it would be helpful? What can you say to that? And have you, State Department itself, been in contact with the ex-governor?
We have been in contact with the Richardson Center. We're not going to comment on the governor's travel or the governor's activity. What we have said is that we have been engaged directly with the Russian government through the appropriate channels to do everything we can to bring home Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan. When President Biden met President Putin in Geneva in June of 2021, they discussed this very issue. They established an appropriate channel that these issues would be worked through. That is the channel that we have been using this time. Through that channel, as the Secretary said, standing here a couple months ago now, we made a significant offer to the Russians. We have followed up on that proposal repeatedly. Those discussions are ongoing. Our concern is that private citizens attempting to broker a deal do not and cannot speak for the U.S. government. And we have warned private citizens not to travel to Russia owing to the dangers that they would face. And of course, those dangers are pronounced, given that we're talking about the case of Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner. Our concern is that anything other than negotiating further through the established channel is likely to hinder the efforts that we have undertaken to see the release of Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner.
State Department spokesman Ned Price at his regular press conference. In London, this reporting from Associated Press, the coffin of Queen Elizabeth II left Buckingham Palace for the last time Wednesday, borne on a horse-drawn carriage and saluted by cannons and the tolling of Big Ben in a solemn procession through the flag-draped, crowd-lined streets of London to Westminster Hall. There, Britain's longest-serving monarch will lie in state for the world to mourn. Her son, King Charles III, and his siblings and sons marched behind the coffin, which was topped by a wreath of white roses, and her crown resting on a purple velvet pillow. Reporting from Associated Press. Here is the moment as the casket was carried into Westminster Hall. Commentary by BBC.
The bearer party, 8 soldiers from Queen's Company of the 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards. 8 young men charged with this most public of duties. And from within Westminster Hall comes the sound of the choirs of the Chapel Royal and Westminster Abbey, singing a setting of Psalm 139. O Lord, thou hast searched me out and known me. Thou knowest my down sitting and mine uprising. Words sung 20 years ago as the coffin of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was carried into this hall.
BBC commentary. As mentioned, the Queen will be lying in state in Westminster Hall for 4 days, giving the opportunity for her subjects to file past. State funeral is Monday. C-SPAN's coverage begins live at 5:30 a.m. Eastern. The White House says that President Biden conveyed the great admiration of the American people for the Queen in a speech to Charles III, saying the Queen's dignity and constancy deepen the enduring friendship and special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. And President Biden also offering his condolences to King Charles, recalling that Biden said the Queen's kindness and hospitality when she hosted him and the First Lady at Windsor Castle in June. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.